Good day, biology class, and welcome to one of our first lectures on cell biology, the basics of life. This is Mr. Moriarty, and behind me is Alfred. He's going to help us with our lecture today. Nice human skeleton that we'll get to understand the whole body later this year, and I just realized he was back there, so hopefully he didn't scare you guys too much. Today we're going to be looking at what the basis of life is. We try to keep these lectures to about 10 to 15 minutes. There will be embedded questions with them then that I want you to discuss internally in your own mind and then write out an answer for me. And then when we come back in class for Zooms, we can discuss this. So the first thing we want to talk about today are what are the main characteristics of a living organism? So first, some of you might be, what is an organism? An organism is anything in life that we consider living. So that can be me, you, your cat, dog, the grass growing in your yard, the fungus growing in your grass, the worm going through the soil. It could be the fish swimming in the sea, or the bacteria that is living on your skin or in your large intestine right now. That is an organism. So I want you to think to yourself for a minute and try to write down, what does it mean to be a living organism? What does life require? What are some things you think about that are just needed for life? You can think about yourself, but then are there other organisms on Earth that need something different than you? So we're going to go through about 8 of these, but I want you to take your time now, and the video should have a place where you can answer these questions. When you're done answering your question, you'll click on, and we'll move through. Okay, so hopefully you guys thought of a few things of what are the characteristics of a living organism, and I'm going to go through them really quick. I have a feeling a lot of you thought that oxygen is required for life. That is a characteristic of a living organism, which makes sense because we die without oxygen. Most of the plants we know die without oxygen. But we do have these little things called microbes. They actually live without oxygen. So oxygen is not required for all life, but it is required for life. Oxygen is very important for one of the characteristics we'll talk about for us, and it's for energy. Life requires energy. Also, I bet you guys came up with water. And water, as we know it here on Earth, is required for life. So at this time, it is considered required for life, but maybe not in the future. But here are the characteristics that science has categorized all things that require life. The first thing, and we're going to talk about this in something called cell theory, is life is made of cells. It can be one cell or multi-cells, but from our understanding of all living things, they are all made of cells. And back here in the background is a giant cell. This is where oxygen comes in for us. All life requires energy. Life is really the organization of energy into something that can replicate. So we use oxygen to burn food, just like a fire uses oxygen to burn. So that is why we need oxygen, but life requires energy. It must be able to reproduce. It must be able to copy itself, or in our case, we don't make exact copies, but it must be able to continue on. So life must be able to reproduce. It must be able to do something called maintain homeostasis. This is going to be a huge vocab word for us the rest of the year, and probably one of the first times you've heard it. But I like to think of homeostasis as keeping a balance. And your body has to stay at a certain temperature or it doesn't work well. Your body has to have a certain amount of water or it doesn't work well. So it must control how much water is in it, even though outside could be really wet or really dry. Our inside has to stay the same. The inside of a cell must stay the same. This is homeostasis. Sometimes I think of my home in the winter. When it gets really cold, I want to keep a constant temperature. I turn on the thermostat and it heats up. In the summer, maybe you have air conditioner or you open the windows to cool it down, but you want to keep your home nice and homeostasis, a constant. Life must be organized. So it's really the organization of energy. Our cells are very organized. Our bodies are very organized, or life does not exist. We die, and then other life eats us. We must be able to respond to the environment. Sometimes you might look at a plant and you go, does it respond to the environment? But maybe this summer you notice that the leaves droop on hot days to keep water in. A plant will grow towards the light. We obviously respond to the environment. If it's cold, I go to get warm, or I heat up my body temperature. Life must be able to grow and develop. We start as one single cell and develop into what we are. Butterfly starts as a caterpillar, well, one cell in a caterpillar, and then to eventually a butterfly. Even a bacteria might start as a small bacteria and still grows a little bit, develops, must reproduce. And this also goes with homeostasis, must be able to exchange materials with its surroundings. So we have water, we have gases, we have things like that that we must be able to exchange in and out. We must get rid of waste after we use it. We must bring in food to eat. So life must be able to exchange materials with its surroundings. That is the characteristics of a living organism. I'd like you to just be thinking about what did you think it was, what it is, and then as the year goes on, we will get more in detail on this. Okay. Along with that, and I'm going to go through this pretty quick, you're probably not going to be tested on anything in this, but we talked about life must be organized. I say life is organized energy. We'll get more into that. And so this is kind of the levels of organization within us, okay? So we're going to start at a non-living level. These are things that are smaller than the cell. The cell is our smallest living unit. And we start with an atom. We've talked about that. And then atoms make up molecules. Molecules might be like carbohydrates or proteins, or sugars are carbohydrates. You might have fats, you might have salts. Okay, molecules then make up organelles within the cell. That's going to be our first big unit. If you look in this picture back here, you can see this really pretty mitochondria and a nucleus, endoplasmic reticulum. These things all make up a cell, which are made up of molecules, which are made up of atoms. Now, once you get all the organelles together, we get our first living level, which is the cell. And the cell makes up all organisms. We'll talk about that in a little bit. And then cells come together to make tissue. Maybe it's like my skin. Maybe it's like the muscle on Alfred back here, or tissue like the bone on Alfred back here, all made of cells. Okay? And then the cells go together to make things like an organ. So back here we have an organ as in a heart, and we have a lung. I'm not going to pull out his brain quite yet, but we'll do that at some other time. Okay, and then organs come together to make organ systems. So if we combine these two, we have our respiratory and circulatory system. Okay, and then all together, you finally get your organism. Okay, the full organism. In this case, it's Alfred. It might just be a simple bacteria. Last part of our lecture today is going to get into something called the history of cells and something called cell theory. This will definitely be a test question, by the way, and you're going to answer some questions on it later. And we're just going to kind of give you some history of the science behind this. And really interestingly enough, to us, it really makes sense. I'm sure all of you sitting at home right now on your computers probably starting to get bored. Think to yourself, I know everything's made out of cells. But go back in time about 300-400 years ago, even 200 years ago, even 100 years ago, well, 200 years ago, and we didn't really know that much about the tiny microscopic world, like these little cells that you need a really high-powered microscope to see, and we weren't sure what life was made out of. And in science, we might have hypotheses, but we need to be able to test and prove things. So we didn't prove that things were made out of cells till a while ago. So I want you in your head to travel back in time and think when you're just looking at things without microscopes, or maybe even the first microscope, and you're wondering what life is made out of. And it gets us to some of our top scientists. So the first guy to actually view cells and look at them was back at the time when we first invented this thing back here called a microscope. And very primitive microscopes back then, just a lens. And this guy, Robert Hooke, used it to look at a piece of cork. Okay, cork is dead plants. And he looked in there and he thought these looked like the rooms of a monk. So not like a prison cell, but where monks slept. Not as many prisons back then. And we thought, oh, they look like a cell. So that is why we call them cells. And he was the first to really look at them. Kind of interesting. And so that is the first guy. And after we looked at that, we started to think, oh, life is made out of these things. So he is responsible for naming the cell. You'll not be responsible for remembering that. But I think it's kind of a funny little story. Next comes this guy called Anton van Leeuwenhoek. He's one of my favorites, and he really liked to look at gross things, like he'd pick his teeth and look at it and all kinds of things in this little tiny microscope. But he's the one who first saw these little things floating around, and he saw things like this, and I think he called them animalcules. You guys might watch a little video on this. And so he was the first to view living cells, and this is a stentor right here. That's a single-celled organism similar to a paramecium. We'll look at those later this year. And he'd look at pond water scraping instead of his teeth, and he found out, wow, life has these weird little animals, and he couldn't describe them much past that. This begins our journey into this idea that things are made of cells, and this is not that long ago. So 1838, I guess we're looking at about 200 years ago. Not that long ago in my mind. And a German botanist named Schleiden looked at plants on microscopes all the time, and he just kept finding out that all the plants are made up of cells. And so he was like, wow, cool, all plants are made of cells. And so he's one of the founders of this idea of cell theory, but he only knew plants, and he could only prove that every plant he's looked at is made of cells. Every part of the plant is made of cells or made from a cell. And then another guy at about the same time is working over here in Germany, and his name is Theodor Schwann, and he was looking at animals, and guess what? He came to the same conclusion. Wow, animals are made of cells. And so these guys are like super famous now for coming up with something that today we would just be like, yeah, duh, everything's made of cells. But in their time, pretty incredible. And so he co-founded the theory that all things are made of cells, but these two were unable to do one very important thing that we need in science, and that's to be able to prove, well, where in the world do cells come from? At this time in the 1830s, a lot of people still thought that cells might just randomly appear. So some people thought that, mice, the cells that make mice, just you had a grain bin and God just kind of made mice appear because mice eat grain. And that is kind of the scientific answer we had for things back then. Not very good. And so that comes to our last guy, Virchow. And he was able to observe cells dividing under a microscope. I'll have you guys look at an onion cell like this. And he could see the stages of cells producing more cells and producing more cells. And he was able to come to the conclusion and prove it that all cells come from pre-existing cells. So we came from a pre-existing cell. Ooh, think about that way back in time when you were born. There was a sperm, there was an egg. Two cells came together to make one cell. But in any case, you came from a cell. One cell makes many cells, and all life came from pre-existing cells and not just randomly, boom, appeared on Earth. Now, the first cell, that's something we could still think about, but that is the idea of cell theory, and I want you to write down these 3 parts to cell theory. Very, very difficult, and you will be tested on this. 1, all living things are composed of cells, right? Plants and animals are made of cells. That's the 2 scientists going into that one. 2, cells are the basic unit and structure of an organism. They are the basic unit of life. If you write down anything, cells are the basic unit of life, and cells come from pre-existing cells. That is cell theory. And after that, we will get very far into the different types of cells, but that is good for today. You guys have a wonderful, wonderful day. And I got to figure out how to stop recording myself now.